Morning, everybody, and happy World AIDS Day. I know it's only on Monday, but here at CMH, we are celebrating it today as our Fridays are a little bit quieter. And we thought it would obviously be appropriate to have an HIV-related topic for our Funda Friday today. And we're specifically going to talk about HIV resistance because things have actually shifted considerably since we've been introducing dolutegravir, and there are some very exciting new guidelines that are in the process of coming out. They might even be released before the end of this year or either early next year in terms of how we test for virological failure and how we think about, for example, third-line regimens. So we're going to go back to some real basics and understanding how resistance develops, how resistance works, but also what is different now that we have dolutegravir in our armamentarium. So very important, my acknowledgements is very much from some extraordinary webinars. So this is 8 hours of webinars that I'm including here. And I have generously used many of the slides from these extraordinary people. So from the HIV drug resistance webinar from October 2024 from Prof Gert Van Zyl, Dr. Leon Levin did an amazing presentation on the new third-line ARV regimens in September of this year. Dr. Kim Steegan in that same talk was talking about how we're going to be looking at dolutegravir levels. And then Prof Francois did a great one on antiretrovirals and advanced HIV disease. So if you really want more detail and you want to understand, especially the data and the stats, I would please encourage you, look at the Knowledgehub webinars. They are high and very good and high quality presentations with the PDFs of the various webinars. So first, we're going to be looking, just going back to HIV virology and understanding how the HIV virus becomes resistant, because that's also going to help us understand a little bit on terms of how the testing works and how we screen for it. Basically, there's only two conditions you need for the HIV virus to become resistant. It has to be replicating. So it has to make more babies. The more it replicates, the more resistance, the quicker resistance will develop, and we will look at that in a moment. And you have to have ARVs in the system. So if you have got HIV and you are not taking ARVs at all, you cannot develop resistance. You need both conditions for resistance to develop, and I'm going to explain that in quite a little bit of detail. So this is this fancy HIV replication cycle. You can see here at the bottom in the blue, that's actually what our CD4 cell looks like. And you can see all those little red viruses are there landing on that CD4 cell. So this is the HIV virus. And what we're seeing here, this straight line here, is actually the surface of our CD4 cell. And important when we look at the replication cycle, it also shows us where the different ARVs can intervene in HIV replication. So we're not actually able to kill the HIV virus itself, because the HIV virus is not even alive. It's just a bit of genetic material floating in your system. What we can do is stop it from making more HIV. So, and we're all aware of, we can stop HIV from entering. That's our entry inhibitors. We don't really use those. We've got our NRTIs and NNRTIs that stops that reverse transcription that happens. We've got our INSTIs that stop the virus from integrating into our DNA for where it uses our own DNA to make more babies. And then the maturation gets blocked by the PIs. And very important, we now have a completely new class available as well, our capsid inhibitors. That's the lenacapavir, which gives more options as well. But we still basically have in our armamentarium, we've got the NRTIs, the INSTIs, and the PIs. And very more important is this replication process is very messy. So the HIV virus literally just uses its enzymes to get into your CD4 cell, and your CD4 cell becomes an HIV reproducing factory, and it makes mistakes. And those mistakes we call mutations. And the more it replicates, the more mutations it potentially makes. And these mistakes are what becomes important. So when we look at viral replication, a couple of terms is to understand that a HIV virus that's still susceptible to all drugs. So the HIV virus, that sort of the original prime HIV virus, we call the wild type virus. And this virus is tough. So this is the toughest of them all. It's the best at replication. But it's weak in terms of ARVs. So any ARVs can kill a wild type virus very effectively. So it's also the most vulnerable to our treatments. So when a virus mutates, what happens is the virus actually deforms. So it makes a mistake in the replication and it comes out a little bit not so well. And this mutant virus might be happened to be resistant to a specific ARV because of this mutation. So this deformity also means it becomes easier to kill. And so we talk about fitness. And mutant viruses, the majority of them, not all of them, are generally much less fit than your wild type virus. So that's also an important concept, right? So if you've got wild type virus and you've got resistant virus in the mix, the wild type virus is going to completely squash out any of the resistant virus. So these resistant viruses, I also like to call them mutants because they are deformed viruses. They actually get names. So, and it has to do with where that mutation takes place. You don't have to understand all of that, but on this particular 184 is the number on the DNA strand, and there is a funny mutation in there. So the M184V mutation, this mutant is resistant to lamivudine. It's the most famous of all of our mutations. And what's interesting about the M184V is it also cripples the virus. It deforms the virus significantly. So this is the reason why you would have noticed that we always have 3TC in every single regimen we give. It's part of our second line regimens and it's part of our third line regimens. In our second and third line regimens, it does nothing to wild virus. Right, it does nothing. Yeah, so let me rephrase that. The M81 for virus, the lamivudine will wipe out all the wild type viruses, but lamivudine can't kill this virus. So if you've got somebody on second line with 3TC, all the 3TC is doing is sorting out any wild virus. But the viruses that are left over, all the mutants with the M184V, are much easier to kill. And this is an important principle of why we keep drugs that even have mutated mutants or creating mutants, why we keep them in the mix. Because those mutants then become easier to kill by other ARVs. So our most famous mutants, I'm not going to go all of them, you're never going to remember them, but M184V, we all need to know, that's the one resistant to lamivudine. And there's also something called the K65R that's resistant to tenofovir. And what's interesting about these two mutations is that both of them makes it much harder for the virus to make an insti mutation. So the virus has deformed itself to be able to be resistant to lamivudine or to be able to be resistant to tenofovir, but now it's very difficult to make the kind of deformity it needs to be resistant to dolutegravir. And this is the reason why we give TLD2, even though there's probably a K65R and an M184 in the mix, which means actually this HIV virus is resistant to lamivudine and resistant to tenofovir, but now we've created a population that the dolutegravir becomes much less chance of resistance against dolutegravir. This is a radical new way of thinking in terms of resistance. But if the patient does not take any ARVs, then actually that wild type is going to take over again, and that M184V and that K65R doesn't stand a chance. So this is the classic picture we always show to show how we use the fancy word, the virus selects. So when you start on treatment, let's assume you've been on treatment before, you've got this K65Rs, you've got these mutants in your system, but now you've not been taking treatment, and so you've got lots of wild type virus that's taken over, and you've got a few mutants that's hanging around. If we did a resistance test, we might not even see these mutants because there's only wild type in the blood. Now we're taking ARVs, and those ARVs are going to wipe out all those wild type viruses. So your lamivudine, your tenofovir beautifully gets rid of the wild type viruses, but what's left over is all of those resistant viruses. And they're slowly going to start now mutating. They've now got a selective advantage. There's no more wild types to compete for CD4 cells. And you will generally see that somebody who's got a resistant virus generally has got lower levels than somebody who's got wild type virus. They just don't replicate quite as well. So they might sit around 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 of these mutants that's been replicating. So when we do a drug resistance test, what we're actually doing is we're looking for the mutants. So we're basically checking which mutants are in that blood. And then we actually put it through a fancy database to interpret for us, if you have these mutants, exactly how resistant are you going to be. And where it gets really interesting is, remember, some mutants might make some ARVs work better. So the Stanford database takes this into consideration and will give a score for you in terms of how easy is this particular virus that this patient has, how easy is it for ARVs to kill, each ARV to kill that particular virus. It's fascinating. So important is that each ARVs work on a different part of the replication cycle, and so it takes different deformities to become resistant. And so for some viruses, literally they make one change, like the M184V, and you've lost lamivudine. Very easy to get resistance. Where with other medicines, like olopinavir, ritonavir, the virus has to mutate and mutate again and mutate again and mutate again to become resistant. And so the word we talk about is genetic barrier. So if a virus becomes resistant easily to a drug, it has what we call a low genetic barrier. If the virus finds it very difficult to become resistant to a drug, we call it a high genetic barrier. And it basically has to do with how many mutations does it need to make to become resistant. And so we have these lovely graphs. These are from those 2 webinars. The one very simple is you can see here the amount of mutations that the virus has to make to be able to become resistant. And you can see our top drug is darunavir. Darunavir is the toughest of them all. My graph on the left here looks both at potency, so how good is the virus at actually killing, how good is the ARV at killing the virus? How quickly does it bring the viral load down? And secondly, what is that, again, genetic barrier to resistance? And again, you see darunavir is the most powerful of all the ARVs that we have. It's great at killing the drugs, and it's also great at killing the virus, and it's also great at having a very high genetic barrier. And you can see second there is lopinavir, ritonavir. Also tough drug, which is why we used to have it in our second line regimen. And dolutegravir is not very far behind. So lopinavir and dolutegravir are both also still within this high potency and high genetic barrier to resistance. But let's look at a couple of other interesting little drugs we know. So efavirenz, for example, not a great genetic barrier at all. Very potent drug. So that's why we used to have it in our first line. It would bring that viral load down very, very quickly. But unfortunately, you would get resistance to it very, very quickly. And you can see abacavir, tenofovir, not even as potent as efavirenz. That's why we used to have 2 of them. You'd combine that with your 3TC, and you can see not a great genetic barrier to resistance at all. And poor little lamivudine, not very powerful and not and very poor genetic barrier. Matter of fact, it's probably the first drug that you lose. But the deformity with lamivudine is very helpful because it cripples the virus so effectively. So we use these drugs then for different reasons. But this becomes important when we're thinking about regimens. So the other concept when we then talk about drug pressure, so we've talked about replication, is understanding how drug pressure now creates it. So we talked about this wild type virus that takes over. And so to be able to actually create resistance, there's a sweet spot. If you've got no drugs in the system, so you're not taking your ARVs at all, the wild type virus is going to take over, and the only thing that's going to be replicating is wild type virus, right? So you can't get resistance if you're not taking your ARVs at all. If you're taking your ARVs properly, then the virus gets suppressed completely and there's no viral replication, so it can't make any mutations. So you need a very particular sweet spot of taking your ARVs, but taking it just badly enough that the ARVs are wiping out the wild type virus and giving those mutants a chance to start replicating and growing. And this is going to become important in being able to understand when we test for viral loads. So basically, in summary, there are 2 conditions necessary to develop resistance. So the viral replication, and I want to point out here, and this is something interesting that Dr. Levin or Prof Levin always says, is that most of your HIV virus actually lives in your spleen, your liver, and your lymph nodes. That's where that HIV little bit of genetic material just sits. When it starts replicating, it spills over into the blood. And so what you see in the blood, as soon as you see virus in the blood, it means that that virus is replicating. Because your immune system will be wiping out usually the virus also as much as it can as it starts to replicate. So virus in the blood, not a good sign. And then we've talked about the presence of ARVs as our second condition. So Next, we're going. Let's look now at just a little bit of history, also appropriate on World AIDS Day, and understanding resistance. And I mean, we are at an extreme